Hey everyone, today I wanted to talk about my favorite thing of all time in Lightroom, the histogram. Now I know I'm geeking out a little bit, but over the years, the histogram has been one of the best tools ever to help new photographers understand photography. There is no right or wrong when it comes to a histogram. A histogram is just telling you what is. And if you're brand new to a histogram, it's up here in the upper right-hand corner of Lightroom. It is a way for us to see what is happening in our image. There are a lot of times in the past when people have said, does my histogram look good? And that question is kind of loaded. Your histogram looks good when your picture looks good and your picture prints good. And this can look vastly different from one picture to the next. A lot of times in the past, I've heard things along the lines of, you want a nice little mountain in the middle of your histogram. Well, for printing purposes, that can be really good. It means that you don't have anything that is too dark, you don't have anything that is too light, and all of the pixels are neatly in the middle, which means they're going to print fine, and someone is probably going to be unable to understand what your picture is about. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is creatively what you want your image to look like. And so moving that histogram around to make the balance of light and dark to match your vision is really important. And again, it can look really different from one person to the next. There are also little terms that you'll hear often with histograms, like, oh, I expose to the right. Or I underexpose. What does that mean? It basically means that your pixels are either over on the right-hand side of the histogram, meaning you push everything to the right-hand side as much as possible so that everything is as bright as possible without losing data, or you underexpose and you tend to have things more to the left side of the histogram. This would be an underexposed image. With today's sensors and modern cameras, we can reliably do either. You can expose to the right or the left, and you're probably going to have a decent image. The reason being, we have a higher dynamic range, which means we have a bigger range of light to dark that's possible in a digital image. Now, I'm going to date myself, but when my kids were little, I had the first digital cameras that existed. And those digital cameras had 1 or 2 megapixels, and everything was blown or everything was clipped. You had the tiniest little sliver of a possible decent exposure. If it was too bright, you lost data. If it was too dark, you lost data. And believe me, almost every scene you lost something because there just wasn't enough data to collect. Well, fast forward 25 years or so, and you are able to photograph just about anything and get almost all the data and recover all the data if you're shooting in RAW. And we'll have another video on RAW, but really, I shoot RAW, I shoot JPEG, I shoot HEIF, H-E-I-F, which is like a high efficiency format, and I'm able to recover a lot. So what do we want to know about the histogram? Well, it's divided into different sections, and in different programs, they'll call the things different names, but really what we're talking about is a scale from dark all the way to bright, or black all the way to pure white. If we look at our histogram here, we're going to see that there is a left limit and a right limit. If we have pixels crawling up the left-hand side, they're black. If we have pixels crawling up the right-hand side, like this, they're pure white. And the goal with any picture is to get the balance right. There isn't just black and white though. There are shades of gray in the middle. We have things that are more considered highlights, not pure white. They're still data, but they're really bright. Then we have things called the mid-range or the mid-tones. You'll often refer to mid-tones when you're talking about fine-tuning editing or working on skin tones. Mid-tones are those things smack in the middle that kind of bridge the gap between the darkest and the lightest. They're middle gray. They are the most easy area of the histogram. Anything in that middle area is understandable. It's not blown. It's not clipped. It's fine. And just to clarify what blowing and clipping is, and people can use clipping interchangeably with both. Basically, those are terms that mean something is wrong. It means you've lost data. The part of the image is either pure black, like someone took a Sharpie marker and just scrubbed it. And we can see that when I move this blacks over here. Anything blue has lost all data. And if I turn off the highlight warning and I zoom in, you're going to see nothing. Okay, there's nothing. It's dark. It's like night. You can't see your hand in front of your face. All right. And when I move it over with the highlights all the way over, not the highlights, let's do whites. That's more like a hammer. We see it crawl up the right-hand side. Everything that is red is pure white. So if I zoom in on this rose and I turn off the highlight warning, we have lost all data in this rose. It is just like a white sheet of paper with no texture, no nothing. It's just white. That makes it not print okay. So clipping is usually considered when we have the blacks completely black. Let's just make this image terrible. Okay. Anything blue here is the clipping warning, meaning everything is black. Everything that is red here is the highlight warning. Everything is white. This is a mess. This will not print well. And it would be hard to actually make an image this terrible in camera, even on auto. But it's just helpful to know if you see red in Lightroom, you're blowing something, which is usually the word that I use for highlight loss, or you're clipping something if you see the blue, which means you have loss in the dark areas. Both are bad. And I say bad, not meaning terrible, because sometimes you will have a black background and you want it to be solid black with no data. You don't want the dust specks to show on your background. You don't want a stray hair to show on your background. So if you want something to be completely black, this is the way to go. And likewise, if you have a white background that you want to be bright white, this may be desirable on that background. So again, I like to say that there is no right or wrong. It just depends on what you want. But in this image, I'm eventually going to want this dark area back here to be completely black with no data. So that will be clipped. And I probably never want highlights to be blown because then they won't print well. And usually our subject is in the highlights. So it's all a matter of what you want. Okay. So the histogram has these different areas, the blacks area, the whites area, the midtones, and then we have the ones that kind of straddle both sides. When you highlight this, it highlights the area down here in this section under auto, which is the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. And as I mouse over the histogram, it's going to highlight the area that corresponds to it. Over here, it's blacks. Right here, it's shadows. Here it is the midtones, which they highlight as being the exposure area, but really I call it midtones. This third area, this third area over here is the highlights area, and then this is the whites. Now, one of the things that I want to clarify about those different delineations is whether they are gentle or whether they are like a hammer, okay? So when we're working with things like whites are like a hammer, meaning they move the histogram a lot. If I move the whites over, you're going to see this histogram boogie over to the right really quickly. Look how aggressive it is. It just climbs those highlights right up the right-hand side. It's very aggressive, okay? Whereas highlights is a more gentle scoot over. It doesn't climb up the right-hand side. It just moves things gently over. So when we're fine-tuning things, I'll tend to go to the highlights versus the whites, because whites are going to just move everything really aggressively. The same can be said for shadows and blacks. Moving shadows over starts to introduce some of these darker areas, which may or may not be desirable based on your image. But the blacks area is going to be like a hammer and quickly make a mess of your image and completely lose data all over the place. It becomes too dark. Everything has its place, though. Every adjustment has its place. But I tend to work in the more gentle adjustments, meaning the highlights and the shadows versus the whites and the blacks. A lot of times people who jump into the whites and the blacks may be unhappy with what they're getting because it moves too quickly. It's kind of like when you're manually focusing a lens and you have a very spinny type manual focus dial or grip on your manual focus lens. It goes too quickly past the area of focus, and it's frustrating. You like to have a nice little grip on it so that you can gently fine tune a manual focus lens. Same thing here. We want things to move a little bit more calculated. In the next video, we're going to go over how to edit with these using the flat evaluation station, which helps you to dial in a variety of ways to present your histogram in acceptable ways for printing. But I want to be very clear that acceptable ways of printing can be very different based on your personal style. Someone who likes a light and airy form of photography is going to have a histogram that looks vastly different than someone who likes a dark and moody look. Both are able to print beautifully. You just have to understand the right and left limit of the histogram and how it's going to work best with your style. I cannot say enough that it's really, really important to either do test prints or get your monitor calibrated. Both are vitally important. Having a calibrated monitor helps you to understand that the color and light that you're seeing in your images is going to be what you're printing and that it's going to be acceptable in the print. However, many printing houses have little idiosyncrasies that you need to get to know as well. For instance, one printer I use often tends to have things be darker than my screen even though it's calibrated. Therefore, I tend to increase the exposure or move that histogram over to the right just a touch more for that printer than I may use for my secondary printer. It's all something to keep in mind because we're moving from digital pixels to ink on paper, and that translation from digital to ink on paper can have a few little things that can happen in the middle that can leave you unhappy with your print. So just keep in mind what's actually happening. We're taking a digital representation of color and light, and we're moving it over to a physical product. So having test prints is vital, as well as calibrating your monitor. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you in the next video. Please subscribe, and if you have any questions, I would love to help, especially if you have ideas for videos you would love to see. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.